Russia's view of its invasion in Ukraine has found a ready audience in China. The government refuses to call Russian actions an invasion, and state media routinely echoes the official Kremlin term special military operation. Comments on Chinese social media, too, are heavily censored in favor of Russia. The result is a heavily one-sided view of a war a majority of the world has condemned. Here's more from Fabian Kretschmer in Beijing.
Vladimir Putin. He's a Formula One driver and an ice hockey champion. How formidable the caption reads. Social media in China is filled with videos like this, idolizing the Russian president. And in state media, coverage of the war almost exclusively shows sympathy for Moscow. It's also emphasized humanitarian aid that Russia is said to have distributed to Ukraine. But very little focus on Russian aggression and the targeting of civilians. The biased reporting has meant huge support for Putin's action among the Chinese people.
The US has a lot of weapons in Ukraine, and the weapons in Ukraine are a threat to Russia. Russia wants to destroy their military equipment. I think it's the right decision.
My personal opinion, it's the fault of both sides. But what fault exactly? As an ordinary person, I cannot really understand.
There's definitely some opportunities that it opens up for China.
Clara Zhao is with the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Research Lab and specializes in analyzing propaganda and disinformation. There's little doubt that China backs Russia, but she says this is more than just Beijing siding with an ally.
And as long as there's destabilization in other regions, they have the opportunity to really expand their power and reach. There is definitely some opportunities that China has with any kind of geopolitical instability for its own motives.
Part of that is to shift blame to Western countries for the conflict. It's also aligned with one of Moscow's key objectives.
Of most relevance and importance is that China declared that it supports and it stands firmly with Russia in opposing the continued eastward expansion of NATO.
Analysts say Beijing also wants to cool sentiment domestically and prevent the war from stirring emotions among people. Despite China claiming to be neutral over the crisis, the widespread online censorship is telling a different story. Voices calling for peace or criticizing Russian President Vladimir Putin simply get erased from Chinese social media. The playbook China is using makes it difficult to gauge people's views on what's happening. But it could have serious negative effects and even undermine international efforts to resolve the crisis.
I think ultimately to shield people from the damaging consequences of war and what is actually happening there on the ground, I think to create apathy in war is a really dangerous sentiment. It's going to lead to a more apathetic generation of people in China for years to come.
Beijing has yet to refer to the attack on Ukraine as an invasion and continues to call it a special military operation. And it says its relationship with Russia remains rock solid.
And joining me now for more is Mareike Olberg. She's an expert in China's media and digital policies and a senior fellow in the Asia program at the think tank, the German Marshall Fund. Mareike, why are Kremlin's talking points on Ukraine being reproduced in Chinese state and social media?
The line that the Chinese state has taken on the war in Ukraine is ultimately that the US and NATO are to blame and that Europe should, maybe seek cooperation with Russia to rearrange its security architecture in Europe. So this is also why Chinese official media and Chinese official sources, such as, the accounts of diplomats, are amplifying these messages coming out of Russia.
And on the one hand, you have the Chinese government saying, quote, conflict and confrontation are not in anyone's interests. And on the other hand, you have its state media repeating Russian claims about the war, therefore justifying it. Why these two opposing strategies?
So what I've called this, what's happening here, is maximum pro-Russian neutrality. So I think what the Chinese government is doing here is leave itself a little out at the end, because there are some issues also from the perspective of the Chinese public in terms of, national sovereignty, which is something that the Chinese government has put left, right, and center in the past, and very clearly this is a problem about the national sovereignty of Ukraine. So it's actually, there's some is facing some criticism for that as well. But the basic point here is that the Chinese state wants to lend as much support as possible to Russia that it can afford, without completely committing itself to this position. So it basically wants to remain sufficiently ambiguous that when things really, really go south for Russia, and things have not been going well, based on all that we know, right, it can still somehow pull itself out and say, but look, we've never supported Russia. We've always, also given humanitarian aid to Ukraine. So really, we haven't been partial in this conflict, even though they have been.
Do you see this media coverage of the Ukraine war somehow setting a precedent for how Russia and China amplify each other's messages in the future?
There's been some amplification in the past between the two, never super coordinated as far as I know, but definitely some coordination and then opportunistic amplification. I do think this is slightly stronger than what we've seen in the past. It is definitely based on the shared assumption that, the West is in decline, other countries are on the rise. So we might just get away with this, with amplifying this and with with taking the Russian side on this. I do think, even though this is an extreme example, I think we're going to see more of this kind of coordination and mutual amplification.
Marika Olberg, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us today.